Hello, this is the fifth of my talks in this series, and it's also the last one. And it's going to end up with this multilingual example, which is the main point of this particular talk. And I'll be using all the things that I've been talking about up to now. So let's have a look at the overview, right? I divided this into three basic points. The first one is a question, and the question is which cognitive systems are active during language processing. So imagine you are using language like I am at the moment, in a particular situation, and the question is how do we represent this in terms of our model of the mind. We've had we've looked at lots of these cognitive systems. Remember the outer layer and the inner layer. The question is which of them are active during language processing? Simple question. And the second example is focusing on the meaning system, the conceptual system, which plays a part which we describe as a hub. It's a hub through which many particular connections between different knowledge systems pass. So it's a kind of crossroads. And this will lead me to talk about what is known as cognitive control, or sometimes people use the term executive function. And the question is, is there a supervisor? Is there a supervisory system in our mind which organizes and integrates everything? And then we'll end up actually with two examples. The first will be an illustrative example of how to describe goal-driven behavior, and the final example will be, as I say, passive bilingualism, which is something which happens when you have more than one language, but one of the languages that you have, and if you're a bilingual it'll just be two, one of the languages that you have you use to understand, but you don't actually use it productively to speak and write. So you just use it to comprehend what's being addressed to you. That's passive bilingualism. Okay, so which cognitive systems are active during language processing? This will help me to make an important point about language processing. Okay, here's our external context, the outside world, all that raw input which is impinging on our sensory systems. And here's the mind, which is the knowledge system, which is supported by our brain. And here are the two, in my case, two systems which are devoted to processing linguistic structure. Right? Some linguists would say, well, there's only one, doesn't matter which way you go. But one thing is important: these two systems will process any language. So they will produce grammars, if you like, of different languages. They don't need to be added to. You don't have to have a second syntactic system for a new language. All of this, and they do it blindly. They have no idea, as it were. We're going to kind of think of them as systems that have ideas. They have no idea what language they're processing or what variety of your single language they're processing. They just process accordingly, and there will simply be different patterns of connection between the various representations. So they process language blindly and make linguistic structure, or activate linguistic structures accordingly. And of course this is completely in the vacuum. These two systems exist in a way that they're not connected with the external context in any direct way. They're sitting there in your mind. And so they need context, they need input, these linguistic systems. They need something to respond to, right? They need to respond to what's coming from other cognitive systems. And here are the systems that represent the outer layer, the ones which are in more direct contact with the world outside. They're all activated. That's the idea of the glowing white sort of area. They all have representations that are activated as you're using a language, and these ones are responding, of course, to the current external context and processing it, but they're also activating representations. Let's take the visual. Where is it? The visual system. Visual representations are being activated, which have been produced due to prior experience of what's currently outside. So it's not just processing the external situation as is, but it's processing every parts of the world which have been recreated inside. This is your world. Each individual has a different set, but the systems are the same. Here is your world. This is the outside world, as far as your mind is concerned, right? Okay, and here are the inherently internal systems, two of them. The conceptual system, which processes meanings, supplies meanings, any kind, whether they're expressible in a language or not. And here is the important affective system, which includes values, positive and negative values, and they will crucially affect processing of any kind, because they will give a boost or provoke some kind of inhibitory response according to what the values are and how strongly they're activated. We'll come on to that in a middle. So there we have the conceptual system with the meaning system and the value system. And as I said before, it also involves the basic emotions. But we'll go into that this time. Right, so here we have the two types of internal context for linguistic processing combined. All of these things are producing more or less representations that are activated, which will be relevant for the current linguistic processing that's carrying on in the middle here. Here are again our two linguistic systems, and here they are all together with the context. So the internal context of linguistic processing, whether it's monolingual or bilingual, multilingual, is represented here. And the big message here should be that if you ask what is involved in language processing as far as the mind is concerned, the answer is everything. So language processing is an activity which takes place involving all kinds of different systems in the mind, possibly all of them to a greater or lesser extent. So anyone who's studying language processing cannot just focus on these two, because language behaviour is crucially affected by what I've called, or what we've called, the internal context, and there it is. Okay, I hope that's more or less clear, because it reprises things I've talked about before, but if it's not clear, you can obviously replay this talk and to get certain things right, and maybe as a cue to a particular question you want to ask me. But now let's turn to the crucial role of the conceptual hub, and as I've said, its association with the idea of cognitive control. Now, very often in talks given on language processing, people put up some kind of model of the mind, which is not a complete model, but it's a model, a partial model, which explains what they're going to talk about. And very often you will have some kind of central supervisory system. It might be called a central processor. The idea being this is where everything is integrated and in a hierarchical manner, and decisions are made, targets are set, decisions are made and executed, and so behavior, including conscious, subconscious behavior, which after all, as we've said, is mostly run according to what's going on in your subconscious mind, which is by far the largest part of your mental activity at any given time. So this is a nice, neat picture of control, right? You've got a supervisory system, but this is very bad. I want you to look at this with the greatest suspicion, as others have done, and it's been called the homunculus fallacy, this idea that we have a mind within a mind, or a hidden supervisor, this hidden supervisor will be, as it were, making decisions for us, sometimes in accordance with our conscious view of things, and sometimes despite it. So, for example, when you walk into a restaurant, it will sort of say, activate all the representations which are important for surviving in a restaurant situation. Or it might say, vote for this candidate. Now, you may have decided that you really ought to vote for candidate 1, but in the end you vote for candidate 2, and you're not quite sure why. Oh, well, it's because your subconscious supervisor has decided for you. It's biased you against what you think you really ought to have done, right? In the same way, you might think, I've got to give up fatty foods, and definitely, although I like cheesecake, I don't want to eat this one, but nevertheless you go ahead and eat it anyway, and you feel guilty, right? And this is because your subconscious supervisor has directed you to eat it anyway. You switch between languages, or sometimes completely, or you might use a particular word. You may feel that it's a conscious choice, but very often it might not be. It might be the work of your subconscious supervisor that we are going to say should be dumped into the trash can, the waste basket, because there is no single supervisory system, there is no mind within a mind, there is no homunculus. But we have to explain how things are coordinated anyway. So how do we do that? And a central role in the explanation is indeed the conceptual system, which acts as a hub, and we'll find that all the networks that are being activated, networks of representations connecting the various cognitive systems, seem to run through the conceptual system. So this is the nearest we will get to an idea of something central and something particularly important in the making of these apparent decisions that mind makes for us. So, let's now look at the two linguistic systems again. There they are, the yellow ones, and they are remarkably badly connected with other parts of the outside world. They are connected with the conceptual system, but first and foremost, of course, they're connected with the auditory system and the visual system if you're a sign language speaker, and that connects up with the phonological system. So that's what I actually, you can regard that as a third connection, which is not made if you don't use sign language. But you have at least definitely this first one with the auditory system and a second one with the meaning system. That accounts for both for speech. And if you're a signer, you have this third one. So maximum 3 connections with other cognitive systems. Of course, these two linguistic systems are connected richly connected with one another, but that's more or less a sort of internal thing. Okay, so we have it's badly connected with the outside world as represented in our mind. However, the conceptual system, the crucial one that is supplying meanings as we speak language, understand language and do whatever we can sign language, the meanings are terribly important, of course, and it turns out that those other cognitive systems which are involved in language processing, right, not linguistic processing, the linguistic structure part, but language processing in general, as we've seen, involves the whole mind. These all have connections with the conceptual system. They're centered on the conceptual system. So when we have something which appears to be a goal-driven system which is not responding to a homunculus, how does this explain the system? Okay, and the basic answer is that apparent decisions by our subconscious mind and in a sense also our conscious mind are made by different networks of representation that happen to be activated in response to the current internal context. We need some concrete examples here. Well, remember that when I'm talking about the cheesecake example here that you see here in the conceptual system, right? This conceptual structure, cheesecake, is so named for convenience. English has no special privileged system status in the mind, of course. So this will going to come out in completely different ways according to the language. This is just a description of the meaning. These are examples of various languages which have the equivalent of a cheesecake. You've got what I think this is Catalan, and this is Mandarin, and this is German, and this I think is Icelandic, this is Polish, this is Japanese, and this is a version of Kurdish. Okay, so many languages will have their own ways of expressing this particular concept. Okay, we've got a concept cheesecake, right, and it's positively valued, which means it has an association with the affective system, which is a positive structure. I've marked it in green to indicate its positiveness. Okay. And this association basically says that the cheesecakes by this individual are valued, and they may be highly valued or slightly valued. That depends on the degree of activation, but they are positively valued. Cheesecakes. So these two are activated when you are confronted, for example, with a cheesecake. Okay, now let's complicate the meaning a bit. When we have a more complicated meaning structure, because we're including the notion of eating. So this is the eating cheesecake idea. It's an eating cheesecake meaning, and it's composed of two associated conceptual representations. This, as we've seen, is already positively valued, but eating cheesecake is also positively valued by this individual. It's a positive thing to eat cheesecake. Right. So and now we have a situation where it's currently unrealized. So the eating cheesecake is a purely kind of abstract idea. It's not currently realized. You're not eating cheesecake at the current moment, and so one of these meanings that are going to be activated is the notion of an unrealized state. So altogether, this complex of conceptual structures of meanings means eating cheesecake is an unrealized state at the moment, whereas these two are positively valued, you might possibly add a negative value to the unrealized state. We'll leave that aside for a moment, but now I've gone and done it, haven't I? I've gone and added a negative association in the affective system with the conceptual system as regards the total composite structure that we've got here. So eating cheesecake, unrealized state, is associated with a negative value. So we've got a bit of a conflict here. And we can resolve the conflict in the following manner by invoking the closest we get to something like cognitive control, which is the invocation of an action meaning, which we could call a goal structure if you like. It's a conceptual structure, and it says seek, right? And this particular one is activated and activates an associated pattern of motor structures which, to cut it short, mean all the things you need to do physically to make that a realized state. And the realized state, of course, is positively valued. All of this is carried out then, and there is no longer any conflict. So this is a very particular example of an apparent decision being made according to a set of associations, a network of associations that have happened in the current situation. So that was an example of goal-driven behaviour, with in itself nothing to do with language. So there has been patterns of association, there have been patterns of co-activation, yes, but there's been no actual supervision, no command. And the closest we got to a command is this conceptual structure, which is results in a connection between this complicated, complex set of meanings in the conceptual system with the motor system. Okay. But this, if at all you can regard this as cognitive control, I think you can. But if you can at all associate this with a single supervisory system, you would be wrong, because in other situations this will not be invoked, and yet there will be a sign of behaviour which you could call goal-driven, but it won't be as a result of this particular conceptual structure being activated. And now we turn to our final and main example, which is an example of passive bilingualism. Remember, passive bilingualism is when you have two languages, but in the case of one language you go on comprehending it, but you don't speak it, or speak it very rarely. So the question is, what lies behind the following goal-driven behaviour? Inhibit, speak home language, right? What is causing you to not speak your home language? Let me explain this a little further, right? So there you are, there I am. Let's take me as an example. I'm a heritage child. I'm being brought up by my parents, who are immigrants, and they speak the language of their home country, their home country, in fact, and it now becomes the language of the home in a new country. This is a composite conceptual structure which involves the conceptual self, which I think I mentioned earlier, me. This is the me, the meaning, me, and this shows how this is associated with something that I belong to, namely a family, and this family is associated with a particular language which we'll call the home language, or the L1. So this meaning as a whole means I belong to a family which speaks a particular language, and connections, associations are made between this and positive value, which is supplied by connections with the affective system. So these are affective structures, and they're associated and they co-activated, of course, which is a result of what happens when two representations are associated. They get co-activated, activate one, and the other will be activated. And this positive set of associations basically mean I'm very happy belonging to a family, and I'm happy with the L1 that is associated with it. Now, at a certain point I have to go to school to start my education and arrive in a completely different environment, and a different context is activated, but in this context this is activated. It's again a belonging meaning, complex meaning, and in this case it's I belong to a group which we shall call classmates, and who speak a particular language. We'll call this the second language, the L2, and all of these concepts individually are positively valued. They have connections with the affective system, and they are positive ones. So I now belong to two groups, and this is what we have in active bilingualism. When I'm at home, I speak the first language, which is the language of the group which I belong to, and that's activated by the internal context that happens to be activated when I am physically at home, or when I'm thinking about home perhaps as well. And when I go to school, I find myself in a situation where I have classmates who I value positively, and they happen to speak a second language which I also value positively. In fact, as a result of continuous rich input, I have managed to acquire it and become bilingual. So no problems here. Whenever I'm in a school environment, the positive value of the second language is activated more strongly as a result of the external context, and that's the one I happily use, both to comprehend and to speak. But when I return home later on, I move into a different context, a different internal context is activated, including the L1, and the L1 which will then also positively valued, will then acquire, by dint of the external context, or the internal context of the moment, a stronger positive value than the L2. Now, we know from research that languages that you know, languages as a bilingual that you know, or multilingual, they are all activated together, and the question is which one comes to dominate, because even if they're all positively valued, the internal context will determine how active particular values are associated values are activated. So it will determine that I will generally use the first language, my home language, when I'm in the home context. So you see how we switch easily without needing any conscious decision between L1 and L2 as a result of different internal contexts. Well, that's a nice situation. Unfortunately, it's not always like that. What, for example, if you still love your family very much, your brothers, your sisters, your parents, but you actually dislike the language? Why would you dislike the language? Well, one obvious reason would be because while you're at school, you have come to take on a negative value that your other favourite group of classmates happen to have. They express dislike for the L1. Maybe they even are cruel enough to make jokes. And you, since you value the classmates particularly strongly, you have accepted this and taken it on as part of your own value of the L1. So when you go home, you can't help understanding the language. There's no choice. If it's spoken to you as normal as always happened by your family, you will of course understand it, but you will react differently, because now your L1 has a negative value. It will no longer outrank the L2. In fact, it will definitely not outrank it, because it will be negatively valued. So in this conflict situation, your only recourse is a passive bilingualism. You cease to respond in the L1 and only reply in the L2, wherever you can. And there you have a situation of passive bilingualism. So you see, depending on responses to changed situational contexts, and the situational contexts are those that are represented in your internal mind, in your internal, so they will be internal contexts. If the internal context changes for one reason or another, particularly because you move from one environment to another in this case, there will be shifts in the nature and strength of the values associated with your various conceptual structures, and these will differ in so much they will trigger different patterns of activation, and this will affect your goal-driven behavior. So you'll acquire a different goal, if you like, and you will behave differently according to the changing internal context. So that means when we talk about cognitive control, we're certainly not talking about a central processor or homunculus dictating things. What we're talking about is shifting patterns of control. And that's, I think, is the most important point I can make about language processing, and so it seems appropriate that we should end at this point. If you have any questions, please ask them, but note that on the website where you might have used to find this particular talk, you can download or even follow online the list of questions relating to this and all the previous sessions in this particular series, to sort of check that you've got the general idea, and if you haven't, please do get in touch, and indeed please subscribe to this channel. So there we are. Check out the list of questions on this series of talks. Feel free to comment, ask your own questions on YouTube or in some other way, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much. That's the end of this particular series.